Dog sits outside an empty house. When neighbors realize why, it's heartbreaking. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun had barely begun its slow descent, casting long golden rays across the abandoned yard. In front of the dilapidated house, where time had seemingly stood still, a lone dog sat quietly, staring at the front door as if expecting someone to walk out at any moment. The old "for sale" sign swung gently in the evening breeze, its rusty hinges creaking like a forgotten memory. To anyone passing by, it was just another neglected house, a broken window here, chipped paint there. But to the dog, it was home. The dog's name was Cooper, though most of the neighborhood didn't know that. His golden coat was matted with dust, his paws worn from endless pacing, and yet his eyes remained sharp, filled with a hope that defied the emptiness around him. Cooper had been sitting there for weeks, rarely moving except to stretch his legs or sip from a small bowl of water left by one of the kind-hearted neighbors. Those who noticed him initially assumed he was just another stray, but soon the whispers began. People started wondering why he refused to leave. Cooper's story was not known to all, but for those who lived nearby, the house held its own tragic tale. It had once belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret. She had been a quiet soul, a woman of simple routines and gentle kindness. Her days were filled with gardening, baking, and chatting with anyone who happened to wander past. She had no family left, or none that anyone knew of, and for years, Cooper had been her constant companion. He had been her shadow in the mornings when she watered her flowers, her comfort in the afternoons when she sipped tea on the porch, and her guardian at night when the wind howled through the trees. Margaret and Cooper were inseparable, and for the longest time, the two were fixtures of the neighborhood. Cooper had been a rescue, a young pup with eyes full of fear when Margaret first found him. She had brought him home one cold winter evening, wrapping him in an old quilt and whispering gentle reassurances. "You're safe now," she had told him, and safe he was. Over the years, the fear in Cooper's eyes was replaced by trust, love, and loyalty. Loyalty that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. When Margaret passed away, it was sudden. A neighbor, Mrs. Hall, had found her one afternoon after noticing that the curtains in the front window hadn't been drawn back like they usually were. She knocked, called out, and eventually let herself in to check. Margaret had passed peacefully in her sleep, her frail frame curled up on the armchair by the window. It was Cooper who had stayed by her side, refusing to leave her even after the paramedics arrived. The house had been empty ever since. Margaret had no living relatives, and the property was quickly put up for sale. But Cooper didn't understand. To him, Margaret had gone into the house one day and hadn't come back out. The place still carried her scent, faint but there. He could still hear echoes of her voice, could still see her hand reaching down to pat his head. And so he stayed day after day, hoping she would return. At first, the neighbors hadn't paid much attention. Dogs sometimes wandered off or lingered near familiar places, and they assumed Cooper would eventually move on. But as days turned into weeks, they realized something remarkable: he wasn't leaving. The sight of him, sitting faithfully by the steps of the old house, became impossible to ignore. The Johnsons, a young couple who lived across the street, were the first to try to help. They had seen Cooper staring at the door every morning as they left for work. One evening, Mr. Johnson approached the house, crouching down a few feet away from the dog. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, offering a piece of bread. Cooper looked at him warily, but didn't move. His gaze flickered back to the front door as if he feared missing Margaret's return. "He won't budge," Mr. Johnson told his wife later. "It's like he's waiting for her to come out." Mrs. Hall, the neighbor who had found Margaret, started leaving food and water near the porch. She, more than anyone, understood the bond Cooper and Margaret had shared. "Poor thing," she muttered one morning as she refilled the bowl. "He loved her more than anyone in this world." Word about the loyal dog began to spread through the neighborhood, and people started stopping by to see him. Children whispered about the ghost house and the dog who guarded it, while adults spoke in hushed tones, touched by the unwavering loyalty of a creature so small yet so faithful. One afternoon, an animal rescue volunteer named Rachel arrived at the house. She had heard about Cooper from a friend and wanted to bring him to a shelter where he could find a new home. Rachel was patient, sitting quietly on the sidewalk, letting Cooper grow used to her presence. She talked to him softly, telling him how much she admired his loyalty and how he deserved to be loved again. But Cooper wouldn't come. For Rachel, it was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. "He's not just a dog sitting in an empty house," she told Mrs. Hall later. "He's mourning. It's like he's holding vigil for her." Cooper's presence at the house stirred something deep within the community. Neighbors who had once been too busy to notice Margaret or her little companion now found themselves drawn to the story. Some brought food for Cooper, others planted flowers in the overgrown garden as a way of honoring Margaret's memory. Slowly, the old house that had once seemed forgotten began to come alive again, not with people, but with kindness. But even with the love and care of the neighborhood, Cooper never moved from his spot. The days turned into weeks, and the golden light of autumn began to give way to the chill of winter. Cooper's vigil remained unbroken, a silent sentinel at the house he could not abandon. The first frost came early that year, painting the grass in silvery crystals as the sun broke through the morning mist. The neighbors worried about him. His fur, though thick, couldn't shield him forever against the biting cold that would soon come. Mrs. Hall called Rachel again. "He's been there too long," she said, her voice tight with concern. "He's not eating as much. The winter's coming, and I'm scared for him." Rachel promised to try once more. This time, she brought a blanket and a small insulated doghouse, placing it near the porch. Cooper didn't move as she worked, his amber eyes fixed on the door as always. Rachel sat near him, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to wait here, Cooper." "She's not coming back," Rachel murmured, her voice catching at the end. She knew he wouldn't understand, but the words needed to be said. "I can help you find another home. A warm place with people who will love you just as much." Cooper turned to look at her briefly, his gaze holding a mix of sadness and resolve, before shifting back to the door. Rachel sighed. "You're something else, aren't you?" she whispered. The story of Cooper began spreading further than just the neighborhood. A local news reporter heard about the loyal dog and arrived one crisp morning with a small crew. They filmed Cooper from a distance, capturing his stoic vigil against the backdrop of the abandoned house, its weather-worn walls and empty windows framing the dog's unwavering loyalty. "It's like something out of a storybook," the reporter said to the camera. "The dog's loyalty is a powerful thing, and Cooper's story reminds us all of the unshakable bond between people and their pets." The piece aired on the evening news, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from viewers across the town and beyond, asking about Cooper, offering to adopt him, and sharing their own stories of loyal pets. Some sent blankets, food, and even small care packages addressed simply to the dog at Margaret's house. Mrs. Hall collected them all, placing them near the steps as a small comfort. But Cooper didn't care for the attention. For him, the world began and ended at the house. He wasn't there for praise or pity. He was waiting for something no one else could give him. Then, one evening, something happened that no one could have expected. A car pulled up to the curb outside the house, its headlights cutting through the dimming twilight. Cooper lifted his head for the first time in hours, his ears perking up as the car door opened. Out stepped a woman, her expression hesitant as she stared at the house. She held a small box in her hands, and her face, though unfamiliar to the neighbors watching from their windows, carried a resemblance to someone they had seen before. The woman's name was Emily, and she was Margaret's niece. She had only learned about her aunt's passing after seeing the news piece about Cooper. Emily explained to Mrs. Hall, who had come outside to greet her, that she had been estranged from Margaret for years. "Family can be complicated," she said softly, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "But I didn't know she was gone. I didn't know how much she loved that dog." When Emily approached the house, Cooper's posture changed. He stood up, his tail wagging slightly, unsure but hopeful. Emily crouched down near the porch steps, holding out her hand. "Hey there, boy," she whispered. "You must be Cooper." Cooper inched forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The scent was faint, but was familiar, an echo of Margaret lingering on Emily's coat. With a soft whimper, he pressed his head against her outstretched hand, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. "She never stopped loving you, did she?" Emily murmured, stroking his fur. "I'm sorry I wasn't here for her. But I'm here for you." The moment was quiet, but profound. It was as though Cooper finally understood that Margaret wasn't coming back. Emily sat with him on the porch as the last light of the day faded into darkness. For the first time in weeks, Cooper rested his head on someone's lap, his weary body finally relaxing. In the days that followed, Emily began visiting the house regularly. She brought fresh food and blankets for Cooper and sat with him on the porch, telling him stories about Margaret, how she had loved to bake pies, how she hummed songs as she worked in the garden, and how she had always called Cooper her guardian angel. "It's like he's been guarding her memory," Emily told Rachel one afternoon, wiping her eyes. "He couldn't let go because he thought she still needed him." Rachel nodded. "And now he has you. That's what matters." It took time, but eventually Emily made the decision to take Cooper home with her. The neighbors watched as Emily coaxed him into her car one cold morning, a blanket draped across the back seat. Cooper hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the house one last time. Then, as if finally ready to move forward, he climbed into the car, his tail wagging gently. The house stood empty once more, but it wasn't the same. The garden, now tended to by the neighbors, was alive with flowers that Margaret would have loved. The porch steps, once worn and lonely, bore the mark of Cooper's quiet vigil, a reminder of a loyalty that had brought a fractured community together. As for Cooper, he settled into his new life with Emily. He had a warm bed, good food, and the gentle companionship of someone who understood his grief. Every now and then, Emily would sit with him in her garden, looking up at the stars and whispering, "She'd be proud of you, you know." And maybe, just maybe, Cooper knew she was. Time passed, and Cooper's story began to fade from the minds of those who had seen it on the news. Life moved forward in the quiet town as it always did, but for those closest to it, Emily, Rachel, Mrs. Hall, and the neighbors, it remained a story they would never forget. They had seen what love, loyalty, and grief could create, even in a creature who could not speak. Emily had brought Cooper home, and while he had adjusted to his new life, there were still days when his eyes held a distant look, as though he were searching for something, or someone, just beyond the horizon. Emily understood that healing took time, not just for humans but for animals too. She gave Cooper space, filling his days with as much love as she could offer. Slowly, she began to see a change. Cooper followed Emily everywhere now, just as he had once followed Margaret. He lay at her feet while she worked, patted beside her on morning walks, and sat patiently by the door each evening, as though still keeping his silent vigil, only now for Emily. It was as though his purpose had shifted, yet remained deeply rooted in loyalty and love. One day, while sorting through old boxes in her aunt's attic, Emily stumbled upon something unexpected. A small wooden chest, its surface worn and scratched with age, sat tucked away in a corner. When she opened it, the familiar scent of Margaret's perfume drifted through the air, faint but unmistakable. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small handwritten journal. Emily spent the next few hours poring through the journal, her hands trembling as she turned each page. Margaret had written about her life with Cooper, how she had found him as a stray puppy, shivering in the rain one autumn evening. She had brought him home, fed him, and given him a place to sleep by the fire. From that day on, he had never left her side. In one entry, dated just a few months before Margaret's passing, she had written, "Cooper has always been my shadow. I don't know how I would have made it through these years without him. On days when the world feels empty, he's there. On nights when my heart aches, he presses his head into my lap, and somehow I know everything will be okay. If I leave this world before him, I hope he finds someone who loves him as much as I do." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she read those words. She closed the journal and looked down at Cooper, who was curled up at her feet, his tail twitching slightly in his sleep. "She trusted you with her heart," Emily whispered. "And now you're here, trusting me with yours." That night, Emily sat with Cooper by the fire, the journal resting on her lap. She stroked his fur, her voice soft as she spoke to him. "You were her guardian angel, weren't you? And now I'll be yours." It was a quiet promise, but one that Cooper seemed to understand. He lifted his head, pressing his nose gently into Emily's hand before settling back down, content. In the weeks that followed, Emily decided to share Margaret's story and Cooper's with the world. She began writing about her aunt's life, the dog who had stood by her side, and the love that had connected them even after death. The story spread far and wide, reaching people who had seen the news piece months earlier and inspiring countless others to share their own tales of love and loyalty. People sent letters to Emily, thanking her for sharing the story. Some wrote about their own pets, the ways they had been saved by animals who gave them hope and comfort during life's darkest moments. Emily realized that Margaret's love for Cooper and his love for her was something universal, something that spoke to the very heart of what it meant to love unconditionally. One letter, in particular, stood out. It came from a man named Thomas, who had been watching Cooper's story unfold since it first aired. In his letter, he wrote, My wife and I lost our dog last year, and I didn't think we'd ever open our hearts again. But seeing Cooper's story reminded me that love doesn't end. It just changes form. Thank you for sharing this story. It helped us heal. Emily read the letter aloud to Cooper one evening, tears streaming down her face. You're helping people, even now, she whispered. You and Margaret, your love is still changing lives. Over time, the abandoned house where Margaret had lived began to take on a new life too. Inspired by Cooper's vigil, the neighbors banded together to restore it. The peeling paint was replaced with fresh coats of soft cream and blue. The overgrown garden was cleared and replanted with wildflowers. A small plaque was placed near the front steps, its inscription simple but powerful. In memory of Margaret and her faithful companion, Cooper. Love never leaves. It lives forever in the hearts we touch. On the day the renovations were finished, Emily brought Cooper to see the house one last time. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the freshly painted porch and the blooming garden. Cooper stood at the edge of the property, his ears perked as he looked toward the house. For a moment, Emily thought he might run to the door, as he had done so many times before. But instead, he sat down beside her, his gaze calm and steady. She'd be proud, Emily said softly, kneeling beside him. You kept your promise, Cooper. You never gave up on her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and purple, Emily felt something shift, something she couldn't quite put into words. It was as though the house, the garden, and even the air around them had been filled with a quiet peace. Cooper let out a soft sigh, resting his head against Emily's shoulder. From that day forward, the house stood not as a symbol of loss, but as a testament to love. People would stop to admire the garden, read the plaque, and smile as they thought of Margaret and the dog who had refused to leave her side. Some even brought their own pets, walking along the path that led to the porch where Cooper's story had begun. For Emily, it was a reminder that love endures, that even in loss, there is beauty, healing, and hope. And for Cooper, it was a chance to rest at last, knowing he had done everything he could for the person who had meant the world to him. In the quiet of her home, Emily would often watch Cooper sleep, his body curled up in the warmth of the hearth. On those nights, she would whisper, "Good night, Cooper. She's watching over you." And maybe, just maybe, Cooper knew she was. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm for Emily and Cooper. The bond they shared deepened with each passing day, built on trust, comfort, and quiet understanding. Emily marveled at Cooper's quiet strength, his ability to love so unconditionally, despite everything he had lost. He had once stood outside Margaret's home, unwilling to leave her behind, and now he had found a new home where he could rest, surrounded by love. Yet, there were still moments when Emily caught glimpses of his past. On chilly evenings, when the wind whistled through the windows and the house grew silent, Cooper would sometimes stir in his sleep. He would let out a soft whimper, his paws twitching as though he were dreaming of running. Emily would kneel beside him, gently stroking his fur. "It's okay, Cooper," she would whisper. "You're safe now." In time, Cooper seemed to heal. The haunted look in his eyes softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He began to explore more freely, tail wagging as he trotted through the fields behind Emily's house. His spirit, once burdened by loss, now seemed to come alive again. Emily watched him with joy, her heart swelling at the sight of him running through the tall grass, barking happily at the birds that scattered in his wake. One crisp autumn morning, Emily received an unexpected phone call. It was a local journalist who had seen the news story about Cooper months earlier and wanted to do a follow-up piece. "People were so moved by his story," the journalist said. "We'd love to know how he's doing now. And how you're both doing, though." Emily hesitated at first. She wasn't sure she wanted to invite more attention into their lives. Cooper had been through enough. But as she looked down at him, lying peacefully at her feet, she realized something. His story deserved to be told, not as a tale of sadness, but as one of love, hope, and resilience. The journalist visited later that week, camera crew in tow. Emily led them to the garden, where Cooper sat quietly by her side, his golden fur glistening in the sunlight. The journalist asked Emily to share the story of how Cooper had come into her life, how she had found him sitting outside Margaret's house, refusing to leave. "It's hard to put into words," Emily said softly, glancing down at Cooper with a smile. The love he had for her, Margaret, it was so strong, so pure. "I don't think he knew how to let go. But I think she led him to me." Somehow, she knew we needed each other. The journalist nodded, clearly moved by Emily's words. And how is Cooper doing now? Emily reached down to scratch behind Cooper's ears, earning a soft wag of his tail. He's doing great. He's happy. I think he's finally found peace. The segment aired a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from viewers who had been touched by Cooper's story. Strangers wrote to Emily, sharing their own experiences of loss and healing. Many sent photographs of their pets, dogs, cats, even horses, who had brought love and comfort into their lives. One letter, in particular, stood out. It came from a woman named Lily, who lived several states away. She wrote, "When I lost my husband last year, I didn't think I would ever feel whole again. But then I adopted a stray dog from a shelter. He was thin, scared, and had clearly been through so much, but he looked at me with these big, soulful eyes, as if he knew exactly how I felt." Cooper's story reminded me that animals have the power to heal us, just as we heal them. Thank you for sharing his story. It gave me hope. Emily read the letter aloud to Cooper as they sat on the porch one evening. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the fields. "You see, Cooper," Emily said, her voice soft, "your story is helping people. You're giving them hope." Cooper seemed to understand. He lifted his head, resting it gently on Emily's lap as his tail thumped softly against the porch. As the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, Cooper and Emily settled into their new normal. Together, they explored the woods behind the house, planted flowers in the garden, and spent quiet evenings by the fire. Emily had never imagined that a dog could change her life so completely, but Cooper had done just that. He had filled the emptiness in her heart, teaching her the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. One afternoon, Emily received a phone call from a local animal shelter. The woman on the other end explained that they had heard about Cooper's story and wanted to name a new adoption initiative in his honor. "We're calling it Cooper's Hope," the woman said. "It's about giving second chances to animals who have nowhere else to go." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she listened. That's beautiful," she said, her voice catching. "Margaret would have loved that." When the shelter launched the program, Emily and Cooper were invited to attend. The event was held in a nearby park, where dozens of dogs, cats, and other rescue animals waited to find their forever homes. Cooper trotted beside Emily, his tail wagging as he sniffed curiously at the animals around him. Children ran up to pet him, their laughter ringing through the air. "You're a hero, you know that?" Emily whispered to him as they walked through the crowd. "You're giving these animals a chance at a new life, just like you got." By the end of the day, nearly every animal at the event had been adopted. Families left with smiling faces and wagging tails, their lives forever changed by the love of a rescue animal. Emily watched it all with a sense of wonder and gratitude, knowing that Margaret's legacy and Cooper's had made it possible. That evening, as Emily and Cooper sat on the porch once again, she looked out at the fields stretching before them, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Cooper looked up at her, his eyes calm and steady. He let out a soft sigh, as though agreeing with her. In that moment, Emily realized something. Cooper had not only saved her, he had saved so many others too. His story had inspired people to open their hearts, to adopt animals in need, and to believe in the power of love and loyalty. He had proven that even in the face of loss, there was hope, that love never truly left us. It simply changed form, finding new ways to touch our lives. And so, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Emily whispered, "Thank you, Cooper, for everything." Cooper rested his head on her lap, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the warmth of the evening, Emily knew that Margaret was smiling down on them both, her heart full, her love eternal. And Cooper, he was finally home. The weeks after the shelter event were filled with a new sense of purpose for Emily. She started volunteering at the local shelter in her spare time, helping coordinate adoption events and fundraising efforts for Cooper's Hope. Inspired by Cooper's story, people from all over the county had come forward to adopt animals, some of whom had been waiting for homes for years. Emily would often bring Cooper along with her to the shelter, where he quickly became a favorite among the staff and volunteers. He was gentle with the other dogs, calm with nervous animals, and patient with curious children who wanted to pet him. It was as though he knew exactly what they needed, An extra moment of kindness, a soft nudge of encouragement, or a steady presence in an unfamiliar place. One day, Emily noticed a small, frightened terrier curled up in the corner of the shelter. He was thin, his fur matted, and he wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. The shelter manager, Martha, explained that the dog had been found wandering alone by the side of the highway. "He's been like this since he got here," Martha said, sighing. "He's scared of everything. We've been trying, but he won't let anyone near him." Emily looked down at Cooper, who was sitting calmly by her side. "Let's see if Cooper can help," she said softly. They approached the terrier slowly, giving him space to feel safe. Cooper walked ahead of Emily, his tail wagging gently, his posture relaxed. When he got close to the little dog, he sat down a few feet away, not making a sound. He simply watched, his steady, reassuring presence filling the space. The terrier lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. "Good boy, Cooper," Emily whispered, sitting down beside him. "Let him come to you." For several minutes, they sat in silence. Finally, the little terrier stood up and took a cautious step forward. Then another. Emily held her breath as he slowly approached Cooper, his body low to the ground, still unsure. Cooper remained still, his eyes soft and calm. When the terrier got close enough, Cooper gently reached out and touched his nose to the little dog's ear. The terrier froze for a moment, then let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh as though he had been holding his breath for a very long time. Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. "You really are something special, Cooper," she murmured. The terrier stayed close to Cooper for the rest of the day, following him wherever he went. By the end of the afternoon, he allowed Emily to touch him for the first time, her gentle hand brushing over his thin, matted fur. It was a small victory, but one that filled Emily's heart with hope. From that day on, the terrier, whom Emily named Toby, became part of her little family. At first, Toby was nervous and shy, always sticking close to Cooper as though he were his protector. But over time, Toby began to trust Emily too. He wagged his tail when she came home, curled up beside her on the couch, and trotted through the fields with Cooper, his spirit coming alive again. Watching Toby's transformation reminded Emily of just how far Cooper had come. He had once been a lonely, grieving dog, unwilling to leave the porch of an empty house. Now he was a healer, a guide, and a source of comfort, not just for Emily, but for every soul he encountered. It was as though Margaret's love lived on through him, spreading kindness wherever he went. One evening, Emily sat on the porch with Cooper and Toby at her feet, the sky streaked with shades of pink and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. She thought back to the day she had first found Cooper, sitting outside Margaret's house, refusing to leave. She remembered the ache in her heart, the way he had looked at her with those soulful eyes, and how she had made a promise to never let him feel alone again. "You kept your promise, Margaret," Emily whispered, her voice soft. "You brought him to me, and now he's bringing others home too." As if he understood, Cooper lifted his head and rested it gently on Emily's knee, his eyes calm and steady. Toby curled up beside him, his tail wagging as he settled in. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the peace of the evening and the love of her two dogs, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life had not always been kind to Cooper or to Toby. They had known loss, fear, and loneliness. But through it all, they had found their way to love, to a place where they belonged. Emily realized then that sometimes the most broken souls were the ones who loved the hardest, who gave the most, and who taught us the true meaning of compassion. In the months that followed, Emily continued her work with the shelter, dedicating herself to the mission of Cooper's hope. She shared Cooper's story far and wide, inspiring others to open their hearts and homes to animals in need. People from all over the country reached out to share their own stories of rescue, love, and second chances. Cooper had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. One day, Emily received a letter from a young boy named Ben. He had seen a video about Cooper online and had been moved to tears by his story. "I used to be scared of dogs because I thought they were mean," Ben wrote. "But then I heard about Cooper, and I realized how kind they can be. My family adopted a dog from the shelter last week. His name is Max, and he's my best friend now. Thank you for sharing Cooper's story. It changed my life." Emily read the letter aloud to Cooper as they sat in the garden. "You see, Cooper," she said, smiling through her tears, "you're changing lives." Cooper let out a soft bark, his tail wagging as he leaned into her side. Emily wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. In that moment, she knew that Margaret's love had not been lost. It had simply found a new home, a home where it could grow, flourish, and touch the lives of countless others. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold, Emily whispered, "Thank you, Cooper, for everything." Cooper's eyes met hers, steady and full of love. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt whole. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Emily's world continued to be filled with joy, purpose, and love. Cooper had become more than just a companion. He was a lifeline not only to her but to everyone who crossed his path. People would visit Emily's small farm just to meet the dog who refused to leave an empty house. His story had spread far and wide, and many considered him a symbol of unwavering loyalty and hope. One chilly autumn morning, Emily received a knock on her door. She opened it to find a woman in her 60s, her face lined with years of experience, but her eyes warm and kind. She clutched a small box in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "Hello," the woman said softly. "Are you Emily?" "I am," Emily replied, smiling warmly. "How can I help you?" The woman glanced down at the box, her lips pressing together as though she were trying to hold back tears. "My name is Ruth. I was Margaret's neighbor years ago. I don't know if Cooper ever told you about me." Emily chuckled softly at the mention of Cooper, telling her anything, and Ruth smiled faintly. "I heard about Cooper's story on the news," Ruth continued. "I couldn't believe it when I saw his picture. I knew it was him." She stepped inside, and they sat at the kitchen table as Ruth carefully opened the box she had brought. Inside was a small collection of items, an old photograph of Margaret holding Cooper as a puppy, a handwritten letter, and a well-worn dog collar with a silver tag. "I found these when I was packing up my things to move," Ruth explained. "Margaret left them with me just before she passed. She asked me to hold on to them because she wasn't sure what would happen to Cooper. I think she hoped someone like you would come along." Emily picked up the photograph, her heart swelling as she looked at Margaret's radiant smile and the little ball of fur in her arms. Even as a puppy, Cooper had that same soulful gaze, the one that seemed to see right into your heart. Ruth handed her the letter, and Emily unfolded it carefully. Margaret's handwriting was delicate and flowing, the words filled with warmth and love. "To whoever finds this precious soul, please take care of him. Cooper is not just a dog, he is love in its purest form. He has been my companion through the hardest moments of my life, my comfort when I felt alone, and my joy when everything else seemed dark. If he finds his way to you, know that you have been given a gift. Love him, and he will love you back 1,000 times over." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks as she read the letter. She looked at Cooper, who was lying on the floor by her feet, his head resting on his paws. He seemed to sense the emotion in the room and lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers as though to say, "I told you I was special." "Thank you for bringing this," Emily said softly, her voice trembling. "It means so much to know how much Margaret loved him." "She would be so proud of you," Ruth replied, squeezing Emily's hand. "And proud of Cooper, too. He's carrying her love forward in ways none of us could have imagined." After Ruth left, Emily sat in the living room with Cooper beside her, the photograph and letter resting in her lap. "She's right, she whispered. "You've changed everything." In the years that followed, Cooper's story continued to inspire people from all walks of life. The shelter grew, thanks to donations and support from those who had been touched by his tale. They built a new wing named Cooper's Corner, a quiet, peaceful space for the shelter's most vulnerable animals, those who were scared, shy, or had been waiting the longest for a home. Emily visited the shelter often, bringing Cooper and Toby along to comfort the animals and show them that love was still possible. One summer afternoon, as Emily sat on the porch watching the sunset, a young family pulled up in their car. They had heard about Cooper's story and wanted to visit. Their little girl, no more than 5 years old, ran up to Cooper with wide eyes and an open heart. Cooper wagged his tail and sat down as the girl gently wrapped her arms around his neck. "Mommy," the little girl said, looking back at her parents, "he's the nicest dog ever." Emily smiled, her heart full. "He really is," she said softly. The family stayed for a while, talking with Emily and playing with Cooper and Toby in the yard. Before they left, the little girl gave Cooper one last hug and whispered something in his ear. Emily didn't hear what she said, but she saw the way Cooper licked the girl's cheek and wagged his tail as though he understood every word. As the car pulled away, Emily looked down at Cooper. "You did it again," she said, scratching behind his ears. "You made someone else's day." Cooper leaned into her touch, his eyes soft and content. Emily realized then that Margaret had been right all along. Cooper was love in its purest form. He had brought healing to her life, to Toby's, and to countless others who had been touched by his story. He had turned loss into hope, sadness into joy, and loneliness into connection. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world grew quiet, Emily sat on the porch with Cooper and Toby curled up at her feet. The air was warm, the sky painted with shades of pink and gold, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "Thank you, Cooper," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." Cooper let out a soft sigh and rested his head on her lap, his body warm and steady. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Emily knew that Cooper's story was far from over. His love would live on, in her heart, in the shelter, and in the lives of everyone he had touched. Because love like his never truly ends. It simply finds new ways to shine. And there, in the quiet embrace of the evening, Emily smiled. Margaret's gift had changed everything.